Hi, and welcome to the first episode of ESG Impact, the New Pioneers. It is my real pleasure to host today Aurelien and Roelens, who is Investment Director and ESG Coordinator at Cube Investment Managers. Hi, Aurelien.
Hello, hi, hello everyone. Nice to see you. Thank you for the invitation.
It's great to have you, and it's really nice to have now new angles and questions about sustainable finance. So could you just give us a quick snapshot of your firm and also role within Cube Investment Managers?
Okay, so for my role, I am currently Investment Director in charge of brownfield digital infrastructure, but I'm also the ESG Coordinator since 2010. I'm overseeing the integration of ESG inside the life cycles of all our investments. Cube Infrastructure Manager is an independent mid-market European infrastructure investor that focus on local and essential services. We are headquartered in Luxembourg. We have a team that is now strong of 60 plus people. Since its foundation in 2007, the business has leveraged its operational and financial capabilities as well as its deep sector expertise to pioneer and transform those local essential infrastructure assets in areas such as fiber to the home, clean mobility, EV charging, district heating, with always a very clear buy and grow operational strategy. To date, we've raised 4 funds, so roughly 4 billion, and we continue to grow.
Great. In terms of ESG, what's your core philosophy there?
Okay, because we have this strategy of buy and grow, because we are focused on sustainable growth, so growing over the long term, ESG is embedded into our investment strategy. We are an infrastructure player, so it's important that all companies deliver those essential services to local communities and that we build an infrastructure that will face and will sustain the challenges of tomorrow's world. So climate adaptation, climate mitigation, rising social inequalities. So in a way, the integration of ESG and having positive social or environmental outcomes is part of our license to operate.
And how complicated was the implementation of SFDR, and how did you solve the data collection problem we have heard a lot about?
On the SFDR, first it's important to note that it's still under implementation. We still receive clarifications every day on the pragmatic implementation details, how to calculate this ratio, etc. So I think the complexity is to be and to stay up to date with the different developments, and that is about doing its homework, but also about talking to your advisors, but infrastructure peers or other LPA members to make sure that we take always the best approach possible. In terms of the data collection challenge, I would say there is still work in progress, but it was not too difficult for us because since say very early, we started with all companies to try to get comprehensive data sets. And since 2015, I would say that we have a consistent methodology to collect data. So there has been already this process of trial and errors that allow to identify obstacles and try to find solutions. For instance, one solution, because we work in the mid-markets, often there is no self-measurement of CO2 emissions by our companies. So the solution that we have is systematically, every year, we have an external advisor that will help us to calculate the carbon emissions for all our companies. There are always problems with estimations, difficulties. There is no perfect data provider that allows us to do that. And we will always have the challenge of incorporating new companies. Again, because we work in small and mid-cap companies, that are not subject to an FRD or will not be subject to CSRD or other regulation that push them to monitor and disclose those extra financial data. We will need to explain to them where to find this data, why to find this data, and what to do with it. We need to convince them that it's not just a tick the box regulatory approach, but that we can use this to then better their operations.
Okay, this looks really like a very well-constructed process. And as co-chair of the LPA ESG Club, I think that topic must have attracted lots of discussions.
Indeed, yes.
And concerning now the Article 6, 8 and 9 funds, how many do you have and manage? And also another question would be, can that classification help out on the fundraising front?
Currently, we have 2 Article 6 funds, but that are funds that are fully invested and have been raised more than 5 years ago. Our latest fund, the one that we're deploying right now, is an Article 8 fund. We try to make it a bit ambitious. This helps clearly with European LPs. There is a demand that we see because themselves classify as Article 8 sometimes, but also for new LPs because it provides a level of transparency and standardization that they appreciate. Though for our existing LPs, they already had a very high level of transparency with us. They had our dedicated report that has ESG KPIs, TCFD reporting, progress versus action plans, incident report, etc. But this did not bring necessarily the same level of standardization than we have now with this Article 8 and SFDR.
Are we really going far enough concerning now sustainable finance? Do we require an extra mile? What's a bit your position there?
The SFDR, if we consider its original intent, which is to fight greenwashing, is a disclosure and transparency regulation. And there we do have a template, we do have this level of transparency that is achieved. It makes it easier for external investors, even if we look outside of private equity, maybe normal persons, to assess the real policies and the real actions of a fund. This is not a label, this is just a matter of transparency. On top of that, with the regulation, you have a good reference that is being created or that is unfolding with the taxonomy. We have the 2 first chapters, we have the climate adaptation, we have the climate mitigation, and that gives a good reference to what could be defined as sustainable investment or green investment. So we have a good regulatory package. It doesn't mean that ourselves as market players, we cannot go beyond, because it's one thing to disclose, but it's better to disclose that you're doing real actions and that you're pushing and engaging your companies to go further when you talk about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, but also themes that maybe are less spoken in the market, like biodiversity or the social issues that some of our companies can face. So it's more a matter of, for us, market player, to exercise our responsibility, our corporate citizenship, than necessarily having additional layers of regulation.
We also really like that approach, to walk the talk and to make it also really happen in real life. The value creation process, how important is it for your firm? And also, do you think that non-financial returns are able to strengthen it in the future?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of the value creation model, is we are again targeting those local essential infrastructure assets in Europe. So there can be rural fiber for connectivity, it can be district heating, it can be public transport, EV charging, etc. And what we're trying to do is grow those companies and make them into well-recognized market players. To do so, we are trying to, and to provide the right adequate returns to our investors, we're trying to target companies that are generally, I would say, again, small and mid markets, so generally below the radar of bigger investors. And we're trying to bring those companies to this level of growth, which make them attractive. And there are 2 ways to do that. Is you need to grow the EBITDA, but you also need to, by growing the EBITDA, you also need to show the perspective of growth after your holding periods. So it's a way to inflate or to increase the multiple, is to have the long-term growth prospects. Also, cost reduction is something that you can work on and de-risking the company. In order to do so, ESG is quite a powerful tool, in the sense that for us as infrastructure investors, we need to anticipate all the trends, all the needs that the local authorities, the local communities will have. So in a way, we ask our companies to innovate a little bit. To give precise example on how this sustainable growth positioning can occur, I can take two in our first fund, Cube One. One was in public transport in the Nordics. Here we were probably one of the first to test electric buses, so the first pilot project back in 2012, just 1 year after we acquired the company, being able to test them in real condition on real lines 2015. So it means that when the first tenders incorporating electric buses arrived in the market in 2017, this company was extremely well prepared to answer those tenders. So not only it allowed to grow further, but also it broadened its perspective to continue to grow over the next years. And we did the same or similar thing in the district heating sector in France, where instead of using the industrial good old gas boiler, we said, okay, let's develop a toolbox of renewable solutions. So it can be the local resources. So the heat can come from geothermia, it can come from CSP, it can come from biomass, or sometimes even the heat of a data center that is there. Have this toolbox to propose to the local authorities alternative solutions that are greener and sometimes cheaper. Obviously, that allowed the company to grow much faster and also, again, give this good perspective because of those capabilities. And this is something that we're replicating in Italy with Cube 2 in the same sector and with Cube 3 in Eastern Europe. So that's one way to grow your EBITDA and grow the exit multiple. You can obviously work on your cost as well. So if you do a cost reduction, and there are very basic example, if you have a public transport company, one of the things that you want to do is having rational driving or eco-driving classes for all your bus drivers, and you will see that you will save 5 to 10% in fuel cost and CO2 emissions, but that gets also into your P&L and your EBITDA. Last, you have the risk reduction, and that's usually the first thing we think when we think about ESG is reducing risks. So it's headline risks. You have, for instance, work accidents is particularly relevant for us in infrastructure. If, for instance, when I'm building a fiber optic network, I have a work accident, even with a subcontractor, maybe the local authority will be more difficult to deliver me permits. So that's risk reduction by avoiding those accidents. Another example that we have is climate risks. Typically, we have one asset in Portugal. We know that there is an increased frequency of wildfires, and this is a trend that unfortunately will continue. And we try to make the network more resilient, notably the big nodes of the network, to make sure that they will not be affected by the wildfires, but also that the power supply will not be disrupted. So it means investing in PV panels, investing in batteries, and also today trying to invest into geothermia to power those pumps, and hence make our infrastructure more resilient. So ESG can always be used as an operational pragmatic tool. It can be used also to find solutions. To give an example, we know that in Europe there is a shortage in terms of workforce. For instance, we are struggling to find bus drivers. We're struggling to find fiber installers. If you look at it with the lenses of diversity and inclusion, we did manage to create programs where we would train people that are, let's say, a bit disconnected from the job market. So it can be troubled youth, it could be refugees. We train them and then we hire them. And usually that solves your HR issue, but it also creates a very positive corporate culture within the company where you do that. So that's the approach that we have in ESG, is really using it in a pragmatic operational manner.
Fantastic. It's helping also integration and shows also and underlines, let's say, how you can do positive things while still then protecting the returns and also bring some advancement to the society. Okay, great. Very concretely now, what are the 5 biggest changes that you implemented within your firm and some of your favorite portfolio companies, which then you can share right now? And did that really move the needle?
We already mentioned some of the changes that can be implemented in our portfolio companies, and that's due to the fact that we have this active managerial approach, and we try to help change the operation, help change the culture. And the question is, how do you do it in a systematic manner? And that question was especially important for us as the company grew quite a lot in the past, let's say, 5-7 years. If I have to highlight 5 changes, the first one will be that we designed in 2014 roughly a ESG due diligence methods and a typical type of report. So it means selecting the different topics that matter for us. So in instance, it could be in environment. In environment, you have biodiversity, you have climate change. You would have obviously health and safety, HR, business ethics, important in infrastructure. So defining those topics, but also defining an approach that is focused on materiality. We're not necessarily going into this ESG due diligence to deep dive in all the topics. We need to deep dive in the ones that are the most material for the company or for the sector. So that's one primary, I'd say, block. The second, I think the most major change was to turn that into a systematic approach. We created in 2016 our environmental social management system. And by this, in this procedure, we would have for all our new investments an exclusion list. We would look at an ESG due diligence made by a third party before going to investment committee. So we would have the investment committee fully informed. We would take those results and factor it into the documentation of the transaction. All that being done by, or I say the primary responsibility, by the deal team, the team in charge of the investments. Then once this is done, it's where the work really starts. We would have an ESG action plan, which is like your 100-day typical private equity plan, except it's for a longer horizon, usually 3 years. And this ESG plan is based on the recommendation of the ESG due diligence or recommendation as ESG team. And it's something that is discussed with the management and the deal team. And it has to be validated ultimately by the board of the portfolio company and by myself. So this way you ensure that it's well understood, well followed, and you have both the authority and also the understanding to progress on this ESG action plan. This one will be followed at least at all level every year, updated with the same process to validate any modifications. And also integrated into a risk management framework. That's an additional layer that we've added. And then when we exit, we would do again an ESG due diligence that allows us to measure the progress, but also informs the new buyer of what has been done and what's left or what would be good to continue a bit on those tracks. So that's kind of a very important change in our organization. Third, it's the creation of our ESG committee, because to make our process evolve, you need to have an holistic and a strategic view. So in the ESG committee, you have the 4 managing partners, so they are founders of the company. You have our senior compliance officer, you have myself, and as guests, you will have all the senior investment team members. And the goal of this committee is really to decide what are the modifications taking into account the operations, the marketing, the compliance and the regulatory. What do we need to do to improve and go one step further in a systematic manner? It can be, for instance, making sure that all our companies will have a climate adaptation plan in place. So that's the goal of the ESG committee. Of course, we need people that drive operationally and support the deal team. So we've created an ESG coordination team. This ESG coordination team, it's again sitting within the investment team. You have 5 persons that are sector coordinator. They are investment team members that are part of our sector teams, and they will be there to support their team, collect the data from the companies, and try to foster best practice within a sector. For instance, in public transport, there are several issues that are quite close from one company to another. So it's fostering those best practices. And then we have 2 team members that are fully dedicated to ESG. So they will have the consolidation, they will have also this vision of the systematic approach that we want across all our portfolios. And they can also help when you do deep dive on a company, for instance, on a specific health and safety issue, or for instance, to train our teams or our companies how to do a climate reduction plan, how to approach, let's say, the science-based targets. So that's also a very important part in making sure that everything goes into the operations. And the fifth point, I would say the fifth change is, and we've been recognized for that, is the early incorporation of the climate dimension. So since 2015, all our companies, we are measuring for them, but all our companies report on Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions plus avoided emissions. We've added also Scope 3 now. All our companies today, when we analyze them, have physical climate risk adaptation plans, and very often have carbon reduction initiatives. So today the carbon reduction initiatives, they are targeted on the most material impact, notably when it comes to Scope 1 and Scope 2. And the next step, and we're still working on it, is to again have a systematic science-based approach to carbon reduction, so to achieve potentially net zero for all companies. That's work in progress.
Wow, fantastic. Really, thanks for sharing that openly, a little bit your setup, showing us behind the curtain and underlining how robust this whole playbook and also framework is. Fantastic. Again, Aurelien, it was really a pleasure to host you today for our first interview of the ESG Impact Pioneers, the new pioneers. And thanks for kickstarting this wonderful series. Hope to see you very soon again. And by the way, we'll soon have also an infrastructure club.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
See you soon.
Looking forward to it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.